10 years ago, a 28-year-old man got the bus into Dublin city centre. 2 hours later, he would be dead. Hundreds would be traumatised, and the nation would be in shock. Owen Dudley grew up in Rathfarnham in South County Dublin. He was the eldest of four, and his mother worked in the Department of Foreign Affairs. His nickname was Crazy Horse. He was described by friends and family as modest, quiet, loving, the nicest guy, harmless, someone who wore their heart on their sleeve. He went to a Gael school and he came from a loving, respectable family. I read that in one of the estates beside his, drugs would have been quite common during his school years. And so, like many people did, Owen experimented as a teenager with drugs. Sadly, this would go on to become an addiction, specifically heroin. His family never gave up on him. They, were always there to help him. I'm not sure if he could have been homeless at some points in his life, but the year before our event takes place, he went to rehab. And when he came out of here, he went into the loving arms of his family and was back at home. 6 months before his death, he started renting a flat in Wicklow. There is less information on the other man in our story. 29-year-old Edward Connors was originally from Barna Park in Sandyford. This is a halting site for the travelling community, and Edward was a member. As a child, Edward contracted meningitis and became deaf. So from a young age, he was deaf and would be speech impaired or mute. And he was one of 8 children. At this point in our story, he is staying in the Judge Darley's hostel in the city centre. At 4 p.m. on the 6th of December 2012, Owen Dudley got the bus into the city centre. What he did next, we're not completely sure. But from what I've read, I can gather or guess that he maybe begged to get some money, or he may have already had money, and that he went to his dealer. A friend of Connor's, Mark Moore, would say that he and Connors had been begging and that they then got heroin and went down a laneway to take it. What happened next is based on witness testimony and CCTV. At 5:40 p.m. at the junction of Dawson Street and Nassau Street, it was busy. People had finished work and were waiting for the bus home. Others were walking through to meet friends for drinks or food. Even Christmas parties would have begun, so the area was busy. The main thing that would be agreed was that Owen Dudley and Edward Connors were interacting at this corner, and that Connors pushed or punched or made some movement towards Owen, who then fell back off the path onto the road. And in this moment, the number 145 bus was going by, and Owen's head hit the ground just as the left rear wheel went by. The 15-ton Dublin bus went over Owen's head, killing him immediately. The injuries, as you can imagine, would be described as catastrophic. In this moment, Mark Moore would say that Edward looked at him and then ran. One witness, a civil servant, Fiona Hallinan, would say that she saw 3 men arguing at this junction. She would also say that she was only 6 feet away. She said she saw one man punch the other in the face. Fiona would also say that the man who punched Owen bulldozed through the crowd and ran. The bus driver would say that he had to try control the bus so that it wouldn't crash. I read that a taxi driver covered Owen up with cardboard to stop people taking photos. Emergency services and Gardaí were actually on the scene immediately, but obviously there was just nothing they could do. And a tent was then put up around Owen's body. By 6:44 p.m, newspapers would say that the Gardaí were on the hunt for 2 men regarding the incident. So that would make me think that Mark Moore also ran or left the scene. Owen was actually wearing several layers, so this leads me to believe that he may have actually planned to go in to, do some begging, or it was 4 degrees, so maybe he just genuinely was that cold. Especially he would have been quite, thin. He wouldn't have had a lot of weight on him, so he would have felt the cold quite easily. but he had like tracksuit bottoms under his jeans, and he had like 3 jumpers and jackets and stuff on. So, it was reasonable for the Gardaí to assume that this was a homeless person. As a result of the injuries, Owen could not be identified. He had the bus ticket from his trip in, so they were able to kind of figure out where he had come from and at what time, but he had no ID on him. So when the news reports came out that a homeless man had died in the city centre, Owen's parents didn't necessarily think anything. This happened on the Thursday night, and by Saturday morning, they still hadn't been able to identify him. So on Saturday morning, the Gardaí issued a statement that the man found had tattoos on his arms, his chest, and his thigh, including a monochrome dragon. When Owen's father heard this, that was when he realised that it was his son. And obviously, they would say like their son wasn't homeless. He had an apartment in Wicklow that he was living in. And I imagine maybe because he didn't live so close to them in Dublin, in Rathfarnham or nearby, that time could have passed a bit before they'd see each other. Maybe they wouldn't talk every day. Mark Moore would say that when he went back to the hostel, Judge Darley's, that he shared a room with Edward, and that by the time he got back, Edward was there. It would also be said later that Edward had changed clothes. He said that Edward wanted to go back out begging. Mark would also say that that night he actually slept rough because his head was melted and he just, I don't know, maybe he just didn't want to be around him. I don't know. The next morning, he actually went to the hostel workers or the caseworkers and told them what had happened. So I think along with this and other witness statements, Gardaí went to Judge Darley's on the Saturday morning and arrested Edward Connors. He put up no resistance and he went with them. So I obviously don't mean to sound insensitive when I say this, but sometimes when you read things, it makes it sound like that he's actually saying, it'll say, oh, and he said, or he told them. So I'm assuming he told them somehow. I know obviously they had to get an interpreter in for him. I don't know if they got him one immediately. So just if I say, oh, and he said, obviously I mean he interpreted it here. He told them some way. He communicated it somehow to them. After being cautioned, Connors told the Gardaí, I'm very sorry about him. It was an accident. When he was brought forward to court, it was said that he was on a methadone prescription. There was also no application for bail, and he was held on remand in Cloverhill Prison. As I said, it was a very busy time. Where it happened was just across from Trinity, so there would have been students, there would have been tourists, there would have been workers. As I said, there was just a lot of people. There was actually a tour, like a school tour up from Kilkenny as well. I read like 100 students up here with their teachers for like a history tour or whatever. And I know I said obviously there was probably the rare few who thought to take pictures or videos or whatever, but for the most part, people were traumatized. The news article that talks about the school kids from Kilkenny, it said that they all then received counselling. Other witnesses and stuff would say that they had trouble sleeping, that they had no appetite, that just the image could not be out of their head. And then witnesses at the scene would have had to be treated for shock. Owen's mother would later say at trial that she was thankful for the people who did cover Owen up to, obviously save other people seeing that, and then also to, protect Owen's dignity. A postmortem would reveal that Owen had heroin, methadone, and cannabis in his system. Edward's story was basically that he knew Owen, that they knew each other from when they used to beg in the city centre. And he said that what they were interacting about was he asked to use Owen's phone so that he could ring someone to buy drugs. And that he says Owen just stumbled backwards and fell off the path, and then what happened. He says that what people saw was him reaching out to grab Owen to try save him, and that his hand then accidentally hit against his face. Owen had got, these drugs in his system. He could have been a little off balance, and, maybe it could be a believable thing that he had just stumbled. He was uneasy on his feet and did stumble back. but like several, like I think it was 7 witnesses, and like that ranges from his own friend to the like civil servants and different workers and stuff, and the bus drivers. The bus driver and then the bus driver behind all say that they saw like a punch. Now some people did say they couldn't tell if it was they couldn't really distinguish between a punch and a grab and stuff like this. But there was also CCTV, and so the jury would have seen this CCTV at that moment. And so I just don't believe that part. I don't believe, oh, I went to grab him or my hand accidentally hit his face. Many people say very clearly that that happened before he began to fall. The phone thing I'm not really sure about because they just got drugs, like kind of only recently. So I don't know. And Mark obviously didn't need a phone to get them wherever he got them from. So I don't know why if they needed more they wouldn't just go do that again. There was no mention of a phone being found on Owen. So I mean maybe that was the argument. Maybe he said he didn't have a phone and Edward didn't believe him. Maybe that could have been the argument. Owen's family believe it was over money, and I kind of would have just jumped to that myself, to be honest, especially because I'm going to go through some other stuff. So the Daily Mail actually managed to track down the dealer, Owen's dealer, who was a girl, equal opportunities for all. And she would say that he bought regularly off her. So Owen had gone into rehab around a year before this, and he had been clean for about 6 months. And like that 6 months in the lead up to this, he started taking it again. I kind of gather that it wasn't like he wasn't severely taking it. That's probably not the right way to say it, but he was kind of just taking enough to kind of do. So she said that he would get 3 bags for €50 twice a week. So they also kind of then say, just a sad little kind of fact, I suppose. At this time, there was about 2,000 rough sleepers in Dublin, and the majority of them would have had either alcohol or a drug problem. And so they would stay in hostels like that, like the Judge Darley's one and stuff. So Judge Darley's would be €16 for the week. I don't think it was kind of, which is good in a way that it wasn't a hostel. I think like you had to kind of call dibs on it every night. I think if you were there, you were staying, you were kind of like a resident there. That's how it comes across in some of the news sources. Like it's nearly all like a residence free. It's not just, oh, you're here tonight and you could be in this other one a different night. This is where you stay and you pay 16 a week. But the thing with these hostels is you're out, like you could be out at 9 in the morning and you're not allowed back in until 10 that night. So that's over 12 hours that you have to do whatever. And I think this is how the issue of people who are addicted or whatever to drugs, it can nearly just continue them in it or make it worse, because like that there's just nothing to do. Merchants, they say Merchants Quay would let people go in and they might be able to get a tea or a coffee or a sandwich or something, a soup or whatever there, and that would kind of get them off the streets for a while. But for the most part, the dealer actually says that there's a lap, that they would do laps. So from O'Connell Street down to North Earl Street, Marlborough Street, down by the Abbey Theatre, so onto Lower Abbey Street, and then back to O'Connell Street. And so essentially they would just do this, like this lap over and over and over. If they need to meet their dealer or whatever, they'd kind of meet them on the way, or they'd stop off or go off, veer off somewhere to meet them. If they're going to beg, then maybe they'd find a spot or whatever. And there's also a whole thing about that can be tensions can come from that, because obviously there would be like prime spots, and homeless people could be arguing about who has a spot, or so this is how kind of altercations can happen. The dealer actually describes Owen as a gentle soul, and she says that unfortunately this meant he got picked on and taken advantage of. So in June 2012, Owen was actually attacked by another addict on North Earl Street. And in only the previous month, he had been beaten up while he was in Merchants Quay having tea. Like that, another addict or another homeless person came over and, started this. I think kind of was like telling him to give him money or something like that. And so he beats them up, and then the two of them are thrown out and banned. I don't understand when that's people's logic of, when that's establishment's logic, like, well, the two of you were involved, it's easier to just like affect the two of you out than try figure out what happened. So she said Owen was always alone, and she said he was never strung out. So I kind of got the impression that like that he came in, like he had his place now. So I kind of got the impression he came in, got his drugs, whatever, and then went home, and then maybe done a bit of begging. I don't have anything that says he actually was begging. I'm just kind of guessing, so I could be completely wrong. Maybe he didn't beg, so he did just go in and out, and this could have been like, could he have been back on his way to get the bus home? But I had kind of wondered, could that be what they argued about? Either a spot for begging, or I believe it was called tapping, or were they arguing about money? Like, was Connors kind of saying, like, give me money? Could Connors have been the person who attacked him one of the other times? I don't know. But I would imagine that the argument wasn't about, can I use your phone? Or, the interaction. I believe it was about, give me money or something like that. So Connors was on remand, as I said, and in May 2014, the case came to trial. Owen's mother would say that her heart was broken after hearing what happened to her son. Obviously, I imagine how he died, even, it's just added a whole other level of trauma and heartbreak that they will never get over. Can't imagine. She says it was a case of the wrong place at the wrong time and that could have been anyone. She also says that Owen's sister would actually go home that way, like to get her bus, and for whatever reason that day she didn't. She went a different way, and like thankfully she did. Connors would have the use of 2 sign language interpreters for the trial. The prosecution would say that they were both heroin users and that they both begged. So the defense was essentially, it wasn't a punch, it was a grab. He was trying to save him, and that's basically what they say. They say that perception can be wrong. With regards to, let's say, the bus drivers and stuff, they would say, well, they were focusing on driving, so they couldn't possibly have really been focusing on what they saw to know exactly what they saw. So as I said, Mark Moore said that he thinks it was 100% a punch, and like this is his friend or his acquaintance or whatever. I also want to say that the news articles all say, like some of them say acquaintance and pal when referring to Owen and Edward's relationship, and like Edwards did say that they did know each other, but I don't think by any means they were friends or pals. The Dublin bus driver who was behind the number 145 bus, so he wasn't driving a bus involved. So Richard Cross, he says that he saw like a scuffle between 2 men and that one hit the other. Now he says he thinks it was a closed fist, but not like a full force punch, but that the other man then fell off the path onto the ground. There was another driver on his bus as well, sometimes they might be taken over or whatever. So David O'Leary said that the person fell straight down and that he believes the person was unconscious. It looked like he was unconscious before he even hit the ground. So this would obviously lead to the being punched theory. Other witnesses would say that a row, quote, exploded. So the jury of 7 women and 5 men were basically told that they needed to decide if Connors had punched Owen, and if this is what caused him to fall under the bus. The prosecution, Tom O'Connell, would say he described it as a frightful gothic death, and that Owen would still be here if it wasn't for Connor's actions. The defence, Caroline Briggs, says that there was a break in causation. She basically says that they connected whatever way, okay, that Owen then took a step back, losing his balance, and fell, and that this was unrelated. Of course it's related. Even if that is the logic, even if he never actually hit him, if he went to hit him and that caused Owen to step back and lose his balance, that is then the cause of him falling onto the road. I don't know how you could use the logic that this was not related. The trial lasted 8 days and the jury found Edward Connors guilty of manslaughter. However, the sentencing was actually take longer to come to court because Connors is essentially like that, deaf and can't speak. He has no way of communicating. So even in Clover Hill, I'm assuming obviously interpreters or something had to be called in if stuff was needed. But for the most part, he couldn't communicate with other prisoners. He couldn't communicate with prison officers. So in February 2015, the Irish Deaf Society said that they were concerned for Connors. They said he had actually only been taught ISL, so Irish Sign Language, at a professional level. So I assume they mean like he wasn't taught it as a child. I'm assuming only kind of in later years that he was, connected through or something, I don't know, but I do know that it is said that he didn't have it from a young age, that he just couldn't communicate. So they said, imagine, and I mean, it's a fair point. Imagine being locked in a cell. There's no, like, you can't hear a radio. You can't understand what's being said on the TV because you can't hear it. And if there's subtitles, you can't read them. You can't talk to prison officers. You can't talk to other prisoners. Any of this. So it would be quite isolating. I get that. So this caused a delay because they basically needed to know if this was the right rehabilitation for him. Like in June 2014, so just after he had been found guilty, it was actually even reported in newspapers that he may avoid jail altogether because Ireland just doesn't have the facilities set up. Dr. Brendan Thomas Montero, he's a psychiatrist and he works in like mental health and deafness. So he basically said that there was a facility in the UK that would be suitable and that an assessment should be ordered to see if it, to kind of suss this out. So the judge ordered the assessment. Montero would say, if not treated, he will revert back to his old ways after release. He has a primitive approach to life combined with addiction, and it's truly explosive. And they say basically that this is what happened with the incident with Owen. Like a primitive approach to life, like what a way to describe someone, like, and what a way to live. He said, these children, so I'm assuming he doesn't just mean deaf children in general. I think he means in this unusual scenario where the person is deaf, they have lost hearing, and then they're in a environment where they may not have the opportunities to learn sign language or to communicate, and so they actually grow up not being able to communicate the way anybody can, or we take it for granted, obviously, but like how you learn to communicate your feelings, how you learn to communicate what you need or what you want, this type of thing. So he says, these children grow up without social, moral, or legal boundaries. And the judge would say that Connors cannot but be described as a victim. He was deaf since childhood and grew up in an environment where there was no opportunity to learn. He had severe communication difficulties. Connors refused to accept responsibility for Owen's death, and he thinks that it's unfair for him to be in prison. The assessment was actually never ordered or fulfilled because of legal issues and the lack of funding. So the lack of funding is kind of obviously self-explanatory. The legal issues, I'm going to imagine, are for previous convictions that Edward Connors had. Connors had a history of acts of aggression and violence. So Connors actually pled guilty to 2 other incidents that happened before Owen's death. So he pled guilty to 2 counts of using a syringe to injure or to threaten to cause injury. So basically, he threatened to use a syringe to rob someone. In May 17th, 2012, in Ballally Shopping Centre in Sandyford, and then in Lots Lane on August 18th, 2012. He was sentenced to 2 years for these concurrently. So I wouldn't be surprised if he was the one who had attacked Owen another time, because he's kind of done it to, to normal people, so to speak. Someone who isn't an addict. So an addict would probably be easier to target than someone who has their wits about them, and so I wonder whether any previous convictions that he had hindered him being allowed to go over to this other facility in the UK. Maybe they wouldn't take him, I don't know. Connors actually tried to blame his friend at the time when it happened. He tried to say that it was his friend who had pushed him or punched him or whatever, and then he blamed it on a head shop drug. Remember the head shops? It was called Snowblow, and he said that he was off his head on snow. Snowblow actually sounds like it could be cocaine, doesn't it? Now, you probably say I shouldn't be including this, but I'm going to. On Reddit and boards.ie and stuff, I was looking, and it's interesting because no one had anything then to say about Owen in terms of negative stuff. Like, it's anonymous, so if someone wanted to kind of be like, oh yeah, no, he done this one thing, or he robbed, or he done something, but no one did. Everybody who kind of commented or anything, people who knew him would have commented, kind of said, oh, I went to school with him, or this or that, and again, all nice comments. I included some of them from that. But then Connors, there is stuff about Connors, I'm just gonna put them in. I mean, obviously I'm saying that where they're from like Reddit and stuff. They're not from a source, like a legit source. But also I just told you from legit sources that he was done for like sticking a syringe up to people. So someone called him the scourge of Sandyford and Dundrum, and that he was robbing and harassing people long before his addiction began. Someone else said that he used to sit at the back of the bus and like smoke hash or whatever, and that the bus drivers would be too afraid to say anything. One source, however, did say that Connors had 64 previous convictions. I mean, we hear this all the time about people having 100 convictions and stuff like this. But so, like, he wasn't an angel anyway. Do you know what I mean? I know we do have to sympathize with his situation in terms of in prison how he is, and obviously I understand how he got to that point. You know, it must have been an extremely frustrating way to grow up, and I pity him as a child like that. But at some point, and so with that, the judge said that he had no choice but to sentence him because he was a quote a danger to society and that he had a serious risk of reoffending. And so on the 23rd of February 2015, Judge Patrick McCartan sentenced him to 7 years. I did read that Cloverhill Prison, like the governor or whatever, said that he was showing an interest in offering ISL classes to other prisoners and stuff, but that it just hadn't come into action yet. So I actually didn't think I was gonna come across an expert, to be honest. By now, obviously, you just think Connors was out or whatever, you know, especially because they never do the full sentence. But when I looked it up, Edward actually died in 2019. Yeah, it was on an RIP.ie article came up. So he died on the 9th of July in 2019 in the Mater Hospital, and it says peacefully. So I'm going to guess, if I had to guess, I'd say it was to do with the addiction maybe. But again, that's just me speculating. I don't know. He could have developed some other illness. But yeah, so he actually died as well now. So that's it. That's the story of poor Owen, who died this horrific death. And I remember it at the time. Like the country was in shock. You were here, like you would have been kind of hearing things, and thankfully, obviously, I didn't know anybody who would have recorded something, or I never saw anything, and I never saw it come up on any of my social media or anything at the time. But I remember them talking about it and people being completely traumatized. The city and all was like, that street was shut down until like the next day and everything. It was just awful. And it's been 10 years. I actually can't believe that it's been 10 years since that happened. But what a horrible story all around, I suppose. Let me know what you think of the case. Do you remember this happening? Did you know someone who, was unfortunate enough to be there to see this horrific thing? What you think of the case in terms of Edward's situation and stuff like that. Let me know what you think. And as always, if you have any other suggestions, let me know. I'd be interested actually to let me know what type of cases you like. I mean, I've told you before that the missing persons ones are kind of my main interest, and then kind of anything unsolved because of the mysterious aspect, but missing persons especially. But tell me what you think. Do you prefer, I know some people prefer solved cases because there's resolution, there's a closure. Other people like me like the mystery. And then I don't know, there are just different random bits, isn't there? So just let me know what type you like. And then if there's types you like, do you prefer female killers? Do you prefer like revenge? Do you prefer crimes of passion? Tell me, I don't know. Tell me what you like. Anyway, I'm not gonna ramble. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your support. See you in the next video. Bye.